They were not soldiers, not nurses, and not spies. They carried no rifles and commanded no battalions, yet their mission held the power to break or save the spirit of every fighting man in the United States Army. In the winter of 1944, across frozen forests and burning cities, 855 young women sat inside armored mail trucks painted with peeling white stars, sorting envelopes by lantern light as artillery thundered outside. Every letter they delivered could pull a soldier back from despair, or remind him why he had to survive one more day. They were the 68th and 88th Central Postal Directory Battalion, the only all-black, all-female unit deployed overseas in WWII, and their enemy was time itself, snow-hammered, against the windows of the old aircraft hangar as the women of the 68th Central Postal Directory Battalion stood at attention, breath fogging in the frozen French air. Their boots were soaked from the march, their greatcoats heavy with sleet, and the smell of wet wool clung to them like smoke. They had crossed the Atlantic on a convoy stalked by German U-boats, marched through bombed-out rail stations, and slept in unheated barracks beside shattered factories, but nothing prepared them for what waited behind those steel doors. When the colonel ordered them inside, every woman expected danger. None expected this. Towering mountains of undelivered mail, bags stacked to the ceiling, stuffed into corners, exploding from torn canvas, piled 20 feet high and stretching the length of the warehouse like a fallen glacier made of paper. Letters dating back 2 Christmases. Packages lost for years. Army records so rotted with mold that the writing bled into shadows. Rats darted through the piles like ghosts of forgotten names. Somewhere among these millions of envelopes were birthday letters that never arrived, death notices that never reached home, and children's handwriting waiting to be seen by fathers who had already died in foreign soil. Major Charity Adams, straight-backed and stern-eyed, felt every gaze turned to her. She was the first black woman ever commissioned as an officer in the Women's Army Corps. Now she faced the impossible, clearing a backlog that the Army had failed to fix in 2 years. The brass expected them to take 6 months. Her women whispered the truth among themselves. Even a year might not be enough. But behind those piles of ruined envelopes were men fighting in snow-choked forests near Bastogne, men living in foxholes on the Siegfried Line, men bleeding in field hospitals where the lights flickered from lack of fuel. Those men needed this mail like lungs needed air. Without letters, morale died. Without morale, armies broke. So when the officer in charge asked if the women of the 68th believed they could handle it, Major Adams didn't blink. She simply nodded once and said, "We'll finish it." All of it. Their first night was hell. The warehouse had no heat. Windows shattered from blast shockwaves, doors warped by fire, snow blowing in from every crack. They worked in trench coats and gloves, breath freezing on their lips. The women hauled sacks of mail across concrete floors slick with ice, sorting by flashlight because the power died every few hours. They built an improvised command center inside the chaos, tables of warped wood, broken crates turned into sorting racks, empty mortar boxes used as catch bins for envelopes too damaged to read. They slept on cots wedged between mountains of mail, boots hanging over the edges, rifles stacked by the door in case snipers or saboteurs crossed the line. Paris was free, but Germany was still only miles away, licking its wounds and waiting for a chance to strike back. They worked 6 days a week. 8 hours quickly became 12. 12 became 14. They sorted by divisions, battalions, companies, last names, nicknames, misspellings, smudged ink, burned edges. They created a tracking system so advanced the Army would later copy it. Thousands of index cards with names and unit changes updated in real time. When they found letters addressed only to Junior or Uncle Buddy, they didn't throw them away. They hunted through records until the right man was found. They learned to identify soldiers by handwriting, hometown, or even the style of a wife's signature. They handled boxes full of homemade cookies hardened into bricks, perfume bottles shattered in transit, Valentine cards wrinkled from seawater. Some letters smelled like gun oil. Others still carried the perfume of a girl who had kissed the paper before sealing it. And through it all, they heard the same rumors whispered through the warehouse. Rumors that hurt far more than the cold. That black women couldn't manage real military work. That they were sent to Europe as punishment. That they would fail just like everyone expected them to. The women of the 68th ignored every word. They kept sorting. They kept organizing. They kept moving forward because somewhere out there, an American soldier was staring at an empty mail slot and wondering why no one wrote him anymore. One night, a mail truck arrived with shell holes in the side, the driver trembling from cold and fear. He had driven through territory so close to enemy lines he could hear German artillery in the distance. Inside his truck were sacks full of parcels, addressed to the 101st Airborne, the same division, now fighting and dying in the frozen nightmare of the Battle of the Bulge. The women snapped into motion, like a machine waking from sleep. Lanterns lit, gloves tightened, coffee poured into tin mugs and swallowed without tasting. They were tired enough to collapse, but soldiers were out there freezing in foxholes, and their families were still speaking to them across oceans through envelopes stamped with love. By dawn, every letter in that shipment was sorted, tagged, and loaded for transport. The convoy rolled out on chains across icy roads, disappearing into the white horizon. When the trucks reached the front, soldiers ripped into the mail like starving men given bread. Some cried. Some laughed so hard they fell into the snow. Others read quietly, clutching the paper like it was fragile glass. One infantryman, face caked with frostbite, read a letter from his daughter. "Daddy, come home for my birthday. I saved you cake." He folded it with shaking hands and whispered to his squad, "I can hold one more day." That was the moment the 6888th understood their mission was not moving paper. It was saving spirits. Word spread faster than a rumor in a barracks. Officers wrote letters praising the women. Newspapers back home began printing stories about them, though rarely on front pages. The Army set targets. The women shattered them. What started as 6 months of work was finished in 3. Millions of letters cleared, sorted, forwarded. Millions of names reunited with families. Millions of reminders that every man, no matter how far from home, was not forgotten. But victory brought something darker. As the women walked through the base, some white soldiers stared, others turned their backs. A few spat insults under their breath, angry that black women were succeeding where white units had failed. The Army sent an inspector to look for faults, to find excuses, to write a report saying the 6888th was not worthy of praise. He demanded Major Adams divide her unit by race for formation. She stared him in the eye and told him she would not. When he threatened disciplinary action, she told him she would send him back to Washington herself. He backed down. Her women marched in perfect formation, shoulders squared, boots striking frozen ground in a sound that echoed like thunder rolling through the ruins of Europe. By the time the warehouse doors shut for the last time, the women had restored something the Army nearly lost: connection. Love returned to foxholes. Laughter returned to barracks. Hope returned to men who believed the world had forgotten them. And yet, as the 6888th boarded their trucks to move deeper into Europe, they carried a bitter truth. No medals waited for them, no parades, no speeches. Their work was invisible, their heroism expected to fade like the ink on old envelopes. They didn't care. They had a job to finish. When the 6888th finished clearing the catastrophe in Rouen, the Army brass expected them to collapse from exhaustion, pack their duffels, and wait quietly for reassignment. Instead, when the trucks rolled toward their next destination, Paris, the women barely slept. They rode through the battered countryside with cold air slicing through the canvas flaps of their vehicles, helmets tipped over their eyes, gloves stiff with dried snow. Burned-out tanks rusted along the roadside. German helmets lay half-buried, in mud, and the trees still showed scars where machine gun bullets had stripped bark to the bone. France was free, but war still breathed in every trench and burned field. The women of the 6888th leaned against each other for warmth, unaware that the next warehouse they would face was even worse than the first. Paris opened before them like a wounded city trying to stand tall. Buildings once filled with music and perfume now bore black scorch marks from Luftwaffe bombs. Bridges sagged under temporary repairs. Streets echoed with the sound of boots, French soldiers, American MPs, and refugees with carts of salvaged belongings. But when Parisians saw the convoy of black women in crisp U.S. Army uniforms rolling past the Seine, their faces changed. Some stared in confusion. Others smiled. A few applauded. Newspapers had whispered rumors of this mysterious new battalion, the one that beat the impossible and delivered hope to the front. Yet none expected them to look like this. young, proud, disciplined, moving like a single heartbeat. Their new warehouse stood near an old railway station. At first glance it seemed abandoned. Shattered windows, boarded doors, patches of ice thick as armor across the loading yard. But when the first trucks reversed toward the platform, reality hit them. Millions more letters, again piled floor to rafters. Parcels leaking molasses and broken perfume bottles. Christmas gifts wrapped 2 years ago, shredded by mice. Mothers begging their sons to write back. Wives asking if their husbands were still alive. The women didn't weep. They went to work. Major Adams formed teams instantly. One squad cleared debris, another set up stoves, another patched holes with scrap timber. The locals watched, astonished. No white officers barking orders, no chaos. The women handled everything themselves. They scrubbed the floors, set up bunks, and stacked the mail into categories so precise that an Army inspector later said the women had rebuilt a destroyed postal system from memory and ingenuity alone. Paris was a different kind of war zone. The city was alive. Dances in basements, cafes lit with candles, jazz spinning from scratchy radios. Soldiers passed through on leave, drinking and smiling for the first time in months. And suddenly, the women of the 6888th found themselves invited to parties they never dreamed of attending. But racism followed them like a shadow. One evening, a group of women tried to enter a soldiers' club. The white doorman blocked them. "Colored aren't allowed," he said, as if the uniforms on their backs meant nothing. A lieutenant stepped forward, jaw tight. "They outrank you," she said. "Stand aside." The man refused. Word spread, reaching Major Adams within minutes. She walked to the club herself, eyes unblinking, voice cold as steel. "This building," she told the staff, "is Army property. You will treat every one of my women as a soldier, or I will shut this place down tonight." The door opened. The women entered. A forbidden space became theirs, if only for a few hours. Even as Paris tempted them with music and laughter, the warehouse demanded everything. Work lights swung from wires, making the shadows move like restless ghosts. Rats crawled over rafters. The smell of mildew mixed with ink and candle wax. And every hour, trucks roared in from the front, mail soaked, burned, or twisted into knots of paper and string. Some letters came back marked deceased. The women handled those envelopes with shaking hands, whispering small prayers before sealing them into packets marked for families who would never be the same. They found love letters written by men who had died only days earlier. They found unopened packages for soldiers who had already been buried in French soil. And yet they sorted with reverence. "Every name," one woman said, "belongs to someone's whole world." One day, a group of French children crept into the warehouse, eyes wide at the mountains of letters. The women let them help. Little hands carried envelopes, giggling as they tried to pronounce American names. It broke the tension like dawn breaking after a night of artillery. The Army photographer who had come to document the battalion snapped picture after picture. Those photographs would become history, though most Americans wouldn't see them for decades. As winter thawed into a wet, gray spring, the battalion did something no one believed possible. They cleared the Paris backlog in half the expected time. The Army had said 6 months. They finished in 3. Again, they mailed 65,000 letters a day, sometimes 70,000. When extra convoys arrived, they did 90,000. Their system ran so perfectly that commanders from other units came to watch, trying to understand how this group of women succeeded where everyone else had failed. But their greatest challenge did not come from the work. It came from the Army itself. During a routine inspection, a white general arrived unannounced. He expected disorder. He expected incompetence. Instead, he saw precision, carts rolling, on rails, alphabetized shelves, women moving like gears inside a living machine. Furious that his expectations had been shattered, he demanded the women be split into segregated sleeping quarters by rank and skin tone. Major Adams stood inches from him and responded with a calm that chilled everyone in earshot. "Sir, we will not do that. We will not waste time on your prejudice. Our only mission here is the mail." The general threatened to court-martial her. Adams didn't flinch. She stared at him with the weight of every woman behind her. A week later, the general backed down. The order disappeared. It was the first time many of the women realized they weren't just fighting a war overseas. They were fighting a war inside their own country's uniform. There were bright mornings, too. Days when a letter finally reached a soldier who had waited a year, and the news inside changed everything. Some soldiers wrote back to the 6888th directly, thanking them by name. Others mailed chocolate bars, silk scarves, or little souvenirs from the front, tokens of gratitude for women they would never meet face to face. One soldier sent a photo of his newborn daughter. On the back he wrote, "Because of you, I met her." The battalion ate meals together, marched together, laughed together. They braided each other's hair, played cards by lantern light, sang hymns over the roaring of generators. And in those moments, the war outside the warehouse walls seemed distant, far enough away that they could pretend just for a heartbeat they were home. Yet war always finds a way back in. Late one night, air raid sirens wailed across Paris. German bombers were making a desperate run. The women grabbed helmets, dove under tables, and waited for the world to shake apart again. When the explosions ended, the warehouse still stood. Not a single letter was lost, not a single mission delayed. At dawn, they were back to work as if the night had been a dream. By the time orders came for their next deployment, the 6888th had processed millions upon millions of letters. Mailbags that had been frozen in time were now moving again across battlefields, hospitals, and ships. The Army tried not to praise them too loudly, but soldiers knew, officers knew, the front lines knew. When the trucks rolled out of Paris, women leaned from the windows, waving as French civilians crowded the sidewalks. Children called out thank yous in accented English. Flowers landed in the laps of laughing soldiers. A city once broken by war now stood cheering them onward. They had proven themselves twice. Soon they were about to do it a third time, and this time, the world would finally notice. When the orders arrived, they came without ceremony, typed on thin Army stationery, handed to Major Adams by a messenger who barely paused long enough to salute. The 6888th was being sent deeper into Germany itself. Leipzig, a city that had once held universities. Music halls and bookstores now lay scarred by Allied bombing and German scorched earth retreats. The women packed without complaint, folding uniforms, muffling clanking utensils, sealing footlockers. Trucks rumbled into the courtyard at dawn, their engines coughing smoke into the cold April air. The women climbed aboard, boots thumping onto steel floors, and Paris faded behind them like a memory half remembered in a dream. The roads turned harsh and broken. Convoys of tanks and infantry rolled westward past them, survivors of battles that had crushed Hitler's armies. Prisoners shuffled along behind barbed wire trucks, hollow-eyed German soldiers staring at the American women with shock. They had never seen black women in uniform. Some looked away. Others stared until the trucks disappeared into dust. Bomb craters swallowed whole lanes. Burned farmhouses sagged under skeletal rafters. Occasionally, the convoy passed white crosses hammered into the mud, too many to count. The women fell silent. Every grave could have belonged to someone whose mail they had touched, whose name they had saved from the pile of forgotten letters. When Leipzig finally rose from the horizon, the sight stunned them. Entire blocks crushed into rubble, factories torn open like tin cans, smoke curling from basements where fires still smoldered, dead horses on roadsides, civilian carts rolling over shattered glass. Yet in the middle of that destruction, the Army pointed them toward a 6-story building that once housed one of Germany's grandest supply warehouses. Now it was the new home of millions more pieces of mail, stacked in moldering towers crawling with vermin, sealed shut by dust thick as ash. 3 stories of letters from American families, stalled for months in the chaos of retreat and counterattack. The women stared up at the broken windows and shell-scarred walls, realizing they were about to start the entire war over again, one envelope at a time. Inside smelled of mildew and burned wood. Pigeons nested in shattered rafters. Snow drifted through holes in the roof. The women tied handkerchiefs over their noses, rolled up their sleeves, and waded into the mountain of envelopes. They built new sorting stations from broken furniture. They dragged crates and sacks into rows. They worked on concrete floors so cold it numbed their feet. Electricity flickered, sometimes disappearing for hours. When the lights died, lanterns came alive instead. Tiny glowing stars floating in a sea of damp darkness. Days blurred. They sorted incoming mail from battalions pushing toward Berlin. They tracked soldiers shifted to the Pacific. They searched for names that no longer existed. Killed in action, stamped in red, crossed many envelopes. The women read those carefully, treating them like living things. Every letter that carried death became a wound they never spoke of but remembered. At night, they dreamed of handwriting, of torn envelopes, of names they would never meet. One evening, as they sat on crates eating cold rations, a messenger burst into the warehouse breathless. "Hitler's dead," he said. The women froze, spoons suspended midair. News spread like fire through paper. Hitler dead. The man who had set the world on fire was gone. In celebration, guns sounded across the city, American, British, French, Russian. Civilians poured out of hiding to sing in the streets. But the women of the 6888th didn't leave their warehouse. The mail didn't stop because Hitler had died. The war wasn't finished yet. Men were still bleeding on front lines. Families were still waiting for news. And in the dark, with rifles stacked by the door, they kept sorting. A few days later, another order arrived. This time it carried a different tone. The army wanted the women to attend a formation parade, an official review. Rumors spread like sparks. The brass wanted to see if the black women marched as well as the white units. Some feared humiliation. Others sensed something deeper. When the day came, the women put on their cleanest uniforms, brushed lint from each other's shoulders, polished boots until the leather shone like obsidian. Major Adams walked the line, adjusting collars, tightening belts. "Chins up," she murmured. "Stride long. Let them see." The reviewing ground was a wide avenue surrounded by destroyed factories and tanks left to rust. White officers gathered on bleachers, expecting sloppiness. Instead, they witnessed precision so perfect it silenced the yard. The women marched like steel blades slicing through the air, drumbeat hearts, synchronized breath, steps landing with the force of a single thunderclap. Not one head turned. Not one boot hesitated. Even the general stared in disbelief. When the command, "Eyes right," rang out, the line snapped as one, cold, confident, flawless. No one spoke until the last squad rolled past. The silence itself was victory. Back at the warehouse, letters kept pouring in. One afternoon, as a train arrived with mail bags bursting through the doors, they found something unexpected. Mail not just for soldiers, but letters addressed to themselves. The U.S. public, hearing faint whispers of their achievements, had begun writing to the women who delivered hope to the front. "Thank you. We are proud of you. You are proving them wrong." Some women cried for the first time in months. Others tucked those letters into their breast pockets like armor. But Leipzig was also the first time the war's shadows reached deeply into the battalion. One night, German civilian looters broke into the warehouse believing the mail held valuables. The guards shouted warnings, then gunshots cracked through the dark. In the morning, 2 looters lay still on the floor, and the women had to step around bloodstains as they returned to their tables. Or had come back into their sanctuary. Still, they did not break. Weeks passed. The stacks shrank. Letters moved again across oceans, airfields, battlefronts, and hospital wards. Soldiers wrote home. Wives wrote back. Children drew crayon hearts. The 6888th carried it all. Then, on May 8, 1945, the bells rang across Europe. Victory in Europe. The war was over. Crowds flooded the streets. Soldiers fired rifles into the sky. Women hugged strangers. Wine spilled across sidewalks. In Leipzig, the 6888th stood outside their warehouse, listening to the roar of celebration rolling through ruined streets like a wave of thunder and relief. No parade invited them. No speeches called their names. But the women linked arms, sang hymns softly, and smiled at one another. They had seen the worst of humanity, and answered it with patience, precision, and love sealed in envelopes. Soon, orders would come again, this time to Birmingham, England, where another mountain of forgotten mail waited. Because when the shooting stopped, a new ocean of letters poured in. Troops writing home, families asking when their sons would return, lovers begging for news. and the only unit in the entire U.S. Army capable of handling the impossible, was already preparing their duffels. They were soldiers. They were women. They were black. And against every barrier thrown at them, they performed a miracle measured not in battles won, but in hope delivered. Birmingham, England greeted the 6888th not with celebration, but with the cold gray silence of a war that had ended on paper, but not in human memory. The city's cathedrals wore scaffolding like crude bandages, windows patched with plywood, rooftops caved in from past air raids. The women rolled through cobblestone streets in army trucks, past civilians who stared with curiosity, confusion, and sometimes awe. They were black, female American soldiers, three things the British population had never seen combined. Children waved. Some adults crossed the street and watched from a distance. Others approached with shy smiles, offering biscuits or flowers. In Birmingham, the battalion felt something they had rarely known in uniform. Respect without conditions, but respect didn't move the mail. The warehouse that awaited them dwarfed both Rouen and Paris. 4 stories of stone and steel, windows blacked by soot, loading bays stuffed with canvas sacks forming a wall that reached the ceiling. Rain leaked from broken skylights, dripping onto letters from Kansas, Detroit, Harlem, Philadelphia. Every corner of the nation searching for sons, fathers, and husbands in foreign soil. The backlog was staggering. Millions upon millions of undelivered pieces. A mountain of paper heavy enough to break the spirit of any ordinary unit. The 6888th was not ordinary. Major Charity Adams and Captain Abby Campbell evaluated the ruins in under an hour. Their voices echoed off cold stone as they issued orders. Stove teams securing heat. Engineering teams patching windows with tar paper. Carpenters building new sorting stations out of crates and shattered shelves. The women set their cots against walls still pitted by shrapnel. They boiled water for sanitation. They hung blackout curtains in case German aircraft returned in desperate nighttime raids, because though Germany had surrendered, Allied commanders feared rogue pilots or saboteurs refusing to accept defeat. Within days, the warehouse breathed with life. Generators hummed. Lights flickered on through dust-thick air. Mailbags thudded open on tabletops. And once again the rhythm began. Unfold, read, decipher, sort, route, dispatch. 8 hours turned to 12. 12 turned to 14. The war might have ended, but the world was writing more than ever. Soldiers wanted to go home. Families demanded answers. Thousands of letters contained one word repeated over and over. When? When are you coming back? When can we see you? When does this nightmare end? Some envelopes clutched photographs of newborns. Others carried wedding rings, sent to men who never lived to receive them. The women handled each piece with reverence. For every soldier who lived, there was celebration. For every soldier who died, there was a quiet ache none of them spoke aloud. One rainy afternoon, a shipment arrived that made the entire battalion freeze. A railcar packed with crates stamped U.S. casualty notifications. These were letters the Army dreaded. Letters that broke families. Letters that ended futures. Each envelope carried a name of a man who would never return. The women formed a silent chain, passing box after box to a guarded room. They sorted them with trembling hands and tear-lined cheeks, knowing every family who opened one would remember the paper, the stamp, and the weight of grief forever. But even grief needed precision. The battalion built a card tracking system so detailed it bordered on unbelievable. Nearly 7 million individual file entries, updated daily. When soldiers transferred from Europe to the Pacific, the 6888th rerouted their mail without losing a single envelope. Their system improved morale across entire divisions. Commanders reported fewer desertions, fewer psychiatric breaks, soldiers smiling again as they unfolded letters still warm from delivery. And yet back home, their accomplishments barely reached a newspaper paragraph, if printed at all. Still, victory arrived quietly. After months of labor, the Birmingham warehouse emptied. Floors swept. Windows repaired. Lights shut off. When the last truck rolled away carrying the final sacks of mail, soldiers and officers lined the street and saluted. The women marched past with pride that needed no applause. Soon after, rumors whispered through the barracks. Orders were coming. The war in Europe was done. The 6888th was going home. The women felt a strange mix of joy and fear. Joy at seeing their families again. Fear of returning to a nation that had not changed just because they had. They had marched under shell fire, slept in bombed buildings, fought prejudice inside their own army, and achieved what the world called impossible. 3 times. But in the United States, they would step off the ship into a society that still forced them to drink from segregated fountains and sit at the back of buses. Nevertheless, they packed their duffels, folded their uniforms carefully, polished their boots. The convoy carried them to Glasgow. The Atlantic wind cut through the docks like knives of frozen salt. A ship waited, its hull scarred, its deck rusted, but its flag snapping proudly in the wind. The women climbed the gangway with the weight of history on their shoulders. Halfway across the ocean, a storm hit, waves hammering the ship, rain lashing steel rails. Some women grew seasick. Others steadied their friends through the night. The storm raged like the war itself, loud, endless, determined to break them. But by dawn the sea was calm, the sky pale gold, and the ship cut smooth across the quiet water. When land finally appeared, the soft blur of the American coastline, the women lined the rails, staring in silence. Some whispered prayers, others gripped dog tags beneath their shirts. A few cried softly, tears swallowed by wind, but there were no bands waiting. No crowds, no press, just a dock, a few officers, and buses that would scatter them to bases where they would be quietly discharged and forgotten, except the world had changed, even if the country was slow to see it. General Eisenhower's staff sent commendations. Officers wrote letters of praise. Soldiers who had received long-lost mail pledged never to forget the women who saved their minds in Europe. One colonel delivered a statement that echoed through military corridors. No unit, male or female, white or colored, accomplished more with less praise than the 688. The women returned home, not to parades but to mothers who hugged them, children who clung to their uniforms, neighbors who struggled to understand what these young women had done across the ocean. They were not given GI Bill housing. They were not offered military medals. They were not thanked by presidents. But years later, when historians opened sealed boxes in forgotten archives, they found photographs, grainy, scratched, breathtaking, of young black women lugging mail bags through war-shattered cities, smiling in cold warehouses, marching in flawless formation. The world finally learned what the Army once tried to hide. The 6888th didn't just deliver letters. They delivered hope. They delivered connection. They delivered life, and they did it faster, smarter, and braver than anyone who doubted them. They returned to a country that did not know their names. The docks in New York smelled of diesel and salt, crowds flowing around the women of the 6888th, as if they were invisible, just another group of soldiers heading home, indistinguishable from the thousands of uniforms pouring back into civilian life. No marching bands greeted them. No speeches honored them. Their convoy rolled quietly down, American highways toward separation centers where stacks of discharge papers waited like stamped endings to a story few people knew had ever begun. Some went back to southern towns where their uniforms earned stares, not respect. Restaurants that served white soldiers refused them at the door. Streetcars forced them to the back again, as if the war had never happened, as if they had not marched through bombed cities and frozen nights for the same flag everyone else pledged allegiance to. But they walked past every insult with the same discipline they had shown in Europe. They had sorted millions of letters under shell fire. They would survive this too. Families embraced them with tears and tight arms. Mothers who prayed through every night hugged daughters they had been certain would die in a war that swallowed men whole. Children tugged at uniform sleeves, asking questions about ships and snow, and the countries on the other side of the ocean. Some women tried to describe the warehouses, so large and cold they swallowed sound, and the mountains of letters holding the voices of people who feared they'd never be heard. Others stayed silent. Some memories were too heavy to carry home. They took jobs where they could, secretaries, teachers, factory workers, postal clerks. A few stayed in the Army Reserve. Many disappeared back into a world that treated them as if they had never worn a uniform at all. They watched white women who served overseas receive recognition and articles in magazines. They watched white postal army units praised for clearing backlogs smaller than the ones they had erased in record-shattering time. But the 6888th never boasted. They had done what needed to be done for men who needed it. Years passed, decades. Their story slipped into dusty file boxes in forgotten warehouses. Photographs curled at the edges. Papers yellowed. The army moved on. The world moved on. Their names faded into silence. But history has a way of waking. It began quietly, an archivist opening boxes sealed since 1945, discovering photographs of young black women in army uniforms surrounded by endless piles of mailbags. Historians found glowing letters from generals praising the unit's impossible achievements. Reporters began asking questions. Who were these women? Why had no one heard their story? One by one, the remaining veterans, white-haired, cane-leaning, full of memory and fire, began to speak. They told of Rouen and Paris and Leipzig. They told of working in freezing warehouses where their breath turned to frost, of sorting 65,000 letters a day with nothing but lanterns and determination, of burying soldiers they never met under envelopes filled with love. Their voices were calm, matter-of-fact, but behind the words lay the weight of history. In Kansas City, a museum exhibit opened displaying their photographs, boots in snow, sleeves rolled, faces set with purpose. Visitors stood before the images with tears on their cheeks. In Washington, Congress passed legislation honoring their service. Descendants of soldiers who once waited desperately for letters learned the truth, that their fathers and grandfathers, sleepless and frostbitten in foxholes, had been kept alive because somewhere, in a warehouse under a shattered roof, a battalion of black women refused to quit. Then, in 2019, more than 70 years after they returned home, a ceremony took place at Fort Leavenworth. Surviving members of the 68th, now in wheelchairs or leaning on the arms of grandchildren, received medals and salutes. Young soldiers stood at attention, honoring women older than their grandmothers, women who had once marched past generals who doubted them. As the audience applauded, the veterans smiled with a quiet pride that never needed validation, only recognition. In 2022, something happened that none of them had expected. The President of the United States signed into law the award of the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest honors, to the 6888th Central Postal Directory Battalion. The room went silent as names were spoken aloud, names once buried in warehouses beneath mountains of forgotten letters. Tears rolled down faces of families who had waited 3/4 of a century to hear their mothers, sisters, and grandmothers honored. It did not erase the years of silence. It did not erase the prejudice, but it was proof that history had finally opened its eyes. Today, their legacy is more than numbers. It lives in every soldier who clutches a letter far from home, every care package delivered across oceans, every mailroom that runs with the precision the 6888th invented. They changed the Army, changed morale, changed lives, not by firing bullets but by carrying words. They proved that victory is not only won by men in foxholes, but by women in uniforms sorting letters through the night. They served a nation that doubted them, and saved a generation that needed them. In cemeteries across the United States, some of their headstones rest beside simple bronze plaques marked U.S. Army. WWII. Most visitors never know these women once kept an entire war connected, but somewhere beyond the silence their footsteps still echo through the cold warehouses of Europe, boots striking concrete in perfect unbroken rhythm. 6888. No mail, low morale. Their motto carried them through darkness, snow, gunfire, and prejudice. They never asked for statues. They never asked for glory. They just made sure every letter reached home.